The last thing she said to me wasn't shouted, wasn't dramatic, and somehow that made it worse, because she looked at me with the calm certainty of someone deleting a file they were done with and said, almost thoughtfully, that maybe I should just disappear. And in that moment I understood that whatever I thought we were had already ended long before this conversation ever started. We were standing in her apartment, the one I'd helped her move into, the one where we'd had lazy Sunday sex and late-night arguments that always ended with laughter and tangled sheets, and she said it like it was advice, like she was doing me a favor, like my presence had become an inconvenience she no longer wanted to acknowledge. I remember staring at the little crack in the wall behind her shoulder, the one she'd once joked about covering with a poster, because my brain needed something solid to focus on while everything else cracked open. And I asked her what she meant. Not because I didn't understand the word, but because I needed to hear her either take it back or soften it, or at least explain herself like I was still a human being worthy of a sentence longer than a command. She didn't raise her voice, didn't insult me, didn't even look angry, and that calmness was somehow crueler than if she had screamed, because she told me she was tired, tired of talking, tired of explaining, tired of feeling responsible for how I reacted to things, and then she repeated it, slower this time, that disappearing would probably be best for both of us. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because my body didn't know what else to do with the shock, and I asked her when she'd decided I was so disposable, and she sighed like I was exhausting her, like this was the exact behavior that proved her point, and she said she didn't want to fight, she just wanted peace, and that maybe disappearing would give her that. The word hung between us, heavy and humiliating, and I felt something in me fold inward, not breaking loudly but collapsing quietly, the way things do when they've been under pressure for too long. I wanted to argue, to remind her of all the nights she had clung to me like I was the only stable thing in her life, to bring up the plans we'd made half drunk on her balcony about trips we'd never taken, to ask how someone goes from being the person you have sex with and cry with and trust to someone you tell to vanish. But I could already see it in her eyes that she was done. Not just with me, but with the idea of explaining herself to me. And I realized that begging would only confirm whatever version of me she had already decided to believe. So I did something that surprised both of us, because instead of arguing or pleading or demanding answers, I went quiet, and I told her I understood, even though I didn't, and I said I'd give her what she wanted, and she looked relieved in a way that hurt more than anger ever could. I walked out of her apartment without slamming the door, without one last dramatic speech, without telling her she'd regret it, because I wasn't thinking about revenge or dignity or closure. I was just trying to get out of there with whatever pieces of myself I still had intact. That night I sat in my car for a long time before driving anywhere, staring at my phone like it might light up and tell me this was all some kind of misunderstanding. But it stayed silent, and I realized that disappearing didn't just mean leaving her apartment. It meant erasing myself from her life entirely. I deleted the draft messages I'd already typed, the ones where I tried to explain how deeply she'd hurt me, how casually she'd dismissed something that had mattered to me, because I could already hear her sighing on the other end, already imagine her telling me I was being dramatic. So I disappeared, exactly the way she asked, not out of strength or self-respect, but because something in me knew that staying would only reduce me further, and if I was going to be erased, I'd do it on my own terms, quietly, completely, without giving her the satisfaction of watching me fade. I stopped texting, stopped checking her stories, stopped asking mutual friends how she was doing, and told myself that silence was temporary, that eventually she'd notice the absence, that eventually she'd feel it the way I did, even though a part of me already suspected the truth, that she'd already practiced living without me long before she ever said the word disappear. I thought disappearing would feel like reclaiming some kind of power, like finally taking control of a situation where I'd clearly lost it, and for the first day or two there was a strange, hollow calm to it, the kind you get after a car accident when everything goes quiet and you're just grateful to still be breathing. But that illusion didn't last long because silence has a way of stretching itself until it fills every corner of your life. I woke up the first morning after it happened and instinctively reached for my phone, not to text her because I'd promised myself I wouldn't, but to see if she'd reached out, if she'd woken up regretting what she said, if she'd realized how brutal that word had been. And when there was nothing there, not even a missed call, I told myself it was still early, that she was probably sleeping, that it meant nothing yet. By the third day, the silence stopped feeling neutral and started feeling deliberate, like a statement she was making without having to say anything at all. And I began to understand that disappearing wasn't a pause or a cooling off period. It was a clean break, one she seemed disturbingly comfortable with. I went through my days on autopilot, answering emails, making small talk with coworkers, laughing at jokes I didn't really hear, all while my brain kept circling the same questions, wondering how someone could erase another person so efficiently, how I could go from being someone she shared her bed with, someone she trusted enough to be naked with both physically and emotionally, to someone she could cut off without a backward glance. At night it was worse, because there were no distractions then. Just me, my thoughts, and the glow of my phone screen that stayed stubbornly empty, and I kept replaying our last conversation, searching for some hidden meaning, some sign that disappear hadn't really meant disappear, that maybe she expected me to fight harder, to prove something, to refuse to go quietly. That possibility haunted me more than the idea that she simply didn't care, because it meant I might have failed some unspoken test, might have misunderstood the rules of a game I didn't even know we were playing. I stopped myself from checking her social media at first, then caved the way people always do when they're lying to themselves. And what I saw made the silence feel louder, because she looked fine. Not just okay, but genuinely unbothered, posting pictures of drinks with friends, inside jokes and captions, smiling the same smile I used to think was just for me. There was no sign of loss, no hint that she was missing anything, and I realized with a slow, sinking feeling that while I was sitting there dissecting every word she'd said, she was already living in a version of reality where I no longer existed. I tried to tell myself this was temporary, that relationships end and people move on, that not every ending needs to be dramatic, but there was something uniquely cruel about being erased so cleanly, about having no argument to point to, no clear villain to hate, just a quiet dismissal that left me questioning my own value. I wondered how long she'd been practicing this absence, how many times she'd imagined her life without me before finally deciding to make it real, and whether I'd ever truly known where I stood with her at all. The days blurred together, each one marked by the same small, stupid rituals, checking my phone when I knew there'd be nothing there, rehearsing messages I'd never send, imagining conversations where she apologized or at least acknowledged that I'd meant something to her once, and slowly it dawned on me that the torture of silence wasn't accidental. It was the point. Silence let her avoid responsibility, let her walk away without having to explain herself, without having to look at the damage she'd done, and it left me holding all the questions she no longer cared to answer. By the end of that week, something shifted, not into strength or closure, but into a colder, clearer understanding, because I finally accepted that she hadn't forgotten about me. She'd chosen not to think about me, and that choice hurt more than any insult ever could. I wasn't waiting for her anymore, not really, but I wasn't free either, because even in my absence, she still occupied space in my head, and I hated how invisible I felt, how easily I'd been replaced by silence, how thoroughly I'd been erased from a story I thought I was an important part of, without realizing that the next chapter was already being written without me. I didn't expect the silence to break the way it did, quietly and almost politely, with a notification that made my stomach drop before my brain even processed the name. Because when her best friend's message popped up on my screen, I stared at it for a full minute, like it might be a trap or a mistake, or some kind of delayed aftershock from a life I was supposed to have already left behind. The message itself was harmless on the surface, just a casual check-in wrapped in enough politeness to feel rehearsed, asking how I was doing, saying she hoped I was okay, adding that she knew things had been weird lately, and I almost laughed at that word, weird, because it felt like calling a house fire a minor inconvenience. My first instinct was to ignore it completely, because disappearing was the one thing I'd done right so far, the one promise I'd actually kept, and replying felt like stepping back into a space where I no longer had any footing. But there was something about the timing that bothered me, something about the fact that she hadn't reached out during the relationship or right after the breakup, but now, after enough silence had passed to make it feel intentional. I wondered if my ex had sent her, if this was some indirect way of checking whether I was still circling, still available, still pathetic enough to respond, and the thought made my fingers hover over the screen, frozen between pride and curiosity. Curiosity won, not because I wanted to reopen anything with my ex, but because I wanted to know what story was being told about me now that I wasn't there to interrupt it, and when I finally replied, keeping it short and neutral, her response came too fast, like she'd been waiting for it, and that was the first moment I realized this wasn't a casual gesture at all. She told me she felt awkward reaching out, but couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been treated unfairly, that my ex had been talking about me a lot lately, and that what she was saying didn't quite line up with the person she'd known me to be, and reading that made something twist uncomfortably in my chest, because it confirmed a suspicion I hadn't wanted to admit, that I was still being discussed, just without my consent or presence. As the conversation stretched on, I became acutely aware of how different it felt to be asked questions instead of accused, to be listened to instead of managed, and I found myself answering honestly in a way I hadn't planned to, explaining that I hadn't disappeared out of spite or manipulation, that I'd done exactly what I'd been asked to do, even if it hurt more than I'd expected. She told me my ex framed it as me being distant, emotionally unavailable, unwilling to fight for the relationship, and I felt a sharp, bitter kind of clarity hearing that, because it was easier for her to believe I'd failed than to admit she'd pushed me away. What unsettled me most wasn't the betrayal of being misrepresented, but the fact that her best friend seemed genuinely troubled by it, pausing between messages, choosing her words carefully, admitting that she'd seen this pattern before, that when my ex decided she was done with someone, she rewrote the ending to make herself more comfortable with it. That honesty shifted something between us, not into flirtation or alliance, but into a shared awareness that we were both standing just outside a narrative we hadn't fully agreed to, and I could feel a subtle tension forming, the kind that comes from realizing someone sees you more clearly than they're supposed to. I caught myself noticing details I'd never paid attention to before, the way she expressed herself thoughtfully, the way she acknowledged uncertainty instead of covering it with confidence, and that awareness made me uneasy, because it felt like a line I hadn't intended to approach, let alone cross. I reminded myself that this was still her best friend, that whatever connection was forming here was complicated by history and loyalty, and a relationship that had already ended badly enough without adding new layers to it. Still, when the conversation finally slowed and she told me she was glad we'd talked, that she felt better understanding my side of things, I realized something had changed, not in my situation, but in how invisible I felt within it, because for the first time since I'd disappeared, someone had reached out not to manage the fallout or extract information, but to actually listen. I put my phone down, feeling unsettled and strangely awake, aware that this message hadn't brought closure or relief, but it had cracked open a door I hadn't known existed, and even as I told myself nothing good could come from walking through it, I couldn't shake the sense that whatever happened next was already in motion, whether I wanted it to be or not. What surprised me most wasn't that we kept talking after that first exchange, but how quickly the conversation stopped feeling like something that needed a justification, because there was no dramatic shift, no obvious moment where we crossed from polite concern into something more intimate, just a slow deepening that happened almost against my will. She started checking in every couple of days, sometimes about nothing in particular, sometimes with questions that felt heavier than small talk had any right to be, asking how I was actually sleeping, whether the silence still felt loud, whether I'd started blaming myself yet. And the unsettling thing was how easily I answered her, how natural it felt to tell the truth without softening it, or trying to make myself sound better than I felt. She told me things too, not gossip, not secrets she was trying to trade for intimacy, but observations she'd been carrying quietly for years about how my ex could be magnetic and generous when she wanted someone close, and how cold she could become once she decided she was done, how she rewrote relationships in her head so the ending always felt justified. Hearing someone else articulate what I'd sensed but never fully trusted myself to believe was strangely grounding, like finally standing on solid ground after weeks of emotional vertigo, and I realized how starved I'd been for that kind of validation. Not the cheap kind that tells you you're perfect, but the honest kind that says you weren't crazy for feeling hurt. There was no flirting, at least not in the obvious sense, but there was a growing awareness between us that made me careful with my words, conscious of pauses, attuned to the rhythm of her replies, and I hated myself a little for noticing how her messages carried warmth without pity, how she never talked down to me or tried to fix me, how she let silence exist without rushing to fill it. I caught myself imagining what she looked like when she read my messages, whether she frowned in concentration or smiled at certain lines, and that awareness carried a quiet charge, the kind that sits just beneath the surface and pretends not to exist. One evening we talked for hours without acknowledging the time, circling the same themes from different angles: loss, loyalty, the way people justify harm when it's convenient, and at some point she admitted she'd felt uneasy watching the breakup unfold, that telling me to disappear had bothered her more than she'd expected, because it felt unnecessarily cruel. I told her I'd replayed that word so many times it had started to lose meaning, and she said softly that it shouldn't, that words like that leave marks even when no one else sees them. And something about the way she said it made my chest tighten, because it was the first time since it happened that I felt understood without having to explain myself into exhaustion. I was aware, uncomfortably so, of the line we were approaching, not because we were doing anything wrong yet, but because emotional intimacy has a way of sneaking up on you when you're not looking for it, and I found myself pulling back slightly, reminding myself who she was connected to, reminding myself that this wasn't supposed to be a refuge or a replacement. She noticed, of course, and instead of pushing, she acknowledged it directly, telling me she didn't want to complicate my life or make things messier than they already were, and that honesty only made it harder to pretend nothing was happening. There were moments when the tension surfaced briefly, in the way she teased me about my tendency to overthink, in the way I noticed how easily she made me laugh at myself, in the way conversations drifted towards sex without becoming explicit, framed more as shared experiences and unspoken understanding than desire. It wasn't lust, not yet, but it was something adjacent to it, something quieter and more dangerous, the kind of attraction that grows out of being seen at your lowest and not being turned away. By the end of that week, I realized that for the first time since disappearing, I wasn't constantly bracing myself against the silence because someone was meeting me where I actually was, not where they needed me to be for their own comfort. I wasn't plotting revenge, wasn't imagining outcomes, wasn't even thinking much about my ex anymore, and that realization scared me more than anything else, because it meant the disappearance hadn't just removed me from her life, it had created space for something new to form, something that felt honest and unforced, and I didn't yet know whether stepping into that space would save me or cost me far more than I was ready to lose. The truth didn't arrive with drama or confrontation. It slipped out the way things often do when people feel safe enough to stop guarding every sentence, and I remember the exact moment because it landed in my chest with a weight that felt both devastating and clarifying at the same time. We were talking late, the kind of late where conversations lose their edges and honesty feels less dangerous, and she hesitated before sending a message. The pause long enough that I knew whatever came next mattered, and when she finally said that there had been someone else involved, not physically at first but emotionally, I felt something cold and precise click into place inside me. She explained it carefully, not as an accusation, not even as a revelation meant to hurt me, but as something she herself was still trying to understand, saying that my ex hadn't told her everything outright, that it had come together slowly through comments that didn't quite line up, sudden changes in behavior, a new name mentioned too casually and too often. I didn't interrupt, didn't rush to react, because suddenly so much of the confusion made sense. The impatience, the way she'd checked out before she officially left, the ease with which she'd told me to disappear like she'd already rehearsed the absence. What surprised me wasn't the existence of someone else, because on some level I think I'd already known, but the relief that followed the confirmation, because it meant I hadn't imagined the distance or misread the signs, and that relief came tangled with anger sharp enough to make my hands shake. I told her that disappear hadn't been about space or peace or self-care. It had been about clearing the stage, about removing me from a story she was already rewriting with someone new at the center, and saying it out loud felt like reclaiming something that had been taken from me without permission. She went quiet for a moment after that, and when she responded, there was a heaviness in her words that hadn't been there before, because she admitted she hadn't known that part, that she'd defended my ex to herself by believing the breakup was messy but honest, and that realizing it wasn't made her question more than just the ending. I could almost picture her sitting with that information, turning it over, realizing that loyalty built on half-truths isn't loyalty at all, and that image stirred something complicated in me, because I didn't want to be the catalyst for her disillusionment, even as I couldn't deny the satisfaction of being believed. The conversation shifted after that, not into anger or plotting, but into a quieter, more dangerous intimacy, because once the truth was out, there was nothing left to pretend about. We talked about how easy it is to vilify the person who gets left behind, how convenient it is to label them distant or uncommitted so you don't have to sit with your own guilt, and she admitted that she'd repeated some of those labels without realizing how unfair they were. I told her I'd blamed myself for days, wondering what I could have done differently, and hearing her say, plainly and without hesitation, that I hadn't deserved what happened felt like a release I didn't know I was holding my breath for. There was an undercurrent to everything now, a sense that the ground between us had shifted, and I became acutely aware of how much trust was being built in the space where loyalty used to live. She apologized to me then, not on my ex's behalf but on her own, for reaching out without understanding the full picture, for unintentionally being part of a narrative that painted me as disposable, and that apology did something unexpected to me, because it made me feel respected in a way I hadn't felt for a long time. As the conversation wound down, neither of us rushed to end it, and in that lingering silence I felt the weight of what had changed, because knowing the truth didn't just reframe the past, it altered the present, creating a bond that felt heavier and more charged than anything we'd shared before. I wasn't thinking about revenge yet, not consciously, but I could feel something aligning beneath the surface, a quiet recalibration of power and perspective, and I understood then that disappearing hadn't removed me from the story at all. It had simply moved me to a position where I could finally see it clearly. Even if what I was seeing came with consequences neither of us had fully reckoned with yet. I wish I could say there was a clear moment where we both acknowledged what was happening and decided, consciously and deliberately, to cross a line we'd spent weeks pretending wasn't there. But that wouldn't be honest, because what actually happened was quieter and messier and far more human than that, unfolding the way things do when two people have already said everything except the one thing they're trying not to admit. After the truth came out, our conversations changed in texture, not in content but in tone, carrying a weight that made every pause feel intentional and every reply feel considered. And I started to notice how often she mirrored my language, how she lingered on certain thoughts instead of moving past them, how she stopped apologizing for reaching out at all. We met in person for the first time under the excuse of closure, which was almost funny given how little closure has ever come from sitting across from someone you're trying not to want. And when I saw her walk into the bar, I felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with loyalty or guilt, and everything to do with the fact that she was attractive in a way I hadn't let myself consider before. There was nothing flashy about it, no deliberate seduction, just an ease in the way she moved, the way she met my eyes without flinching, the way she smiled like she already knew what I was thinking and wasn't going to comment on it unless I did first. We talked for hours, not circling the past so much as dissecting it, pulling apart moments that had felt confusing at the time, and laying them out in the open where they made more sense. And somewhere between the second drink and the quiet that followed it, I realized how close she was sitting, how our knees brushed when we shifted, how my body was responding to her presence long before my brain had given permission. There was tension there, undeniable and charged, but it wasn't rushed or frantic. It was patient, almost restrained, the kind that builds slowly and makes you acutely aware of every inch of space between you. At one point she asked me carefully, whether I'd thought about her in ways that weren't appropriate, and I laughed, not because it was funny, but because pretending otherwise felt insulting to both of us, and I admitted that yes, I had, but that I didn't trust those thoughts. That attraction born out of shared hurt can be misleading, and she nodded like she'd already had that argument with herself and lost. She told me she'd tried to shut it down, to remind herself of her role, of her history, of what it would look like if anyone found out, but that none of those reasons had made the pull go away. They'd just made it heavier. The moment it happened wasn't explosive. It was almost tender, a pause in conversation where neither of us spoke because there was nothing left to clarify, and when she leaned in, it felt less like a decision and more like an acknowledgement of something that had already been true for a while. The kiss wasn't rushed or aggressive. It was slow and deliberate, carrying all the restraint we'd been practicing up until then. And I remember the strange mix of guilt and relief that washed over me as it deepened, because part of me knew this would complicate everything, and another part knew I'd never forgive myself if I pretended it hadn't mattered. Sex came later, unhurried and grounded, not performative or vengeful, just two people choosing each other in a way that felt real and present, and I was struck by how different it felt from what I'd lost, how attentive she was, how tuned in, how much it seemed to matter to her that I was there with her rather than somewhere else. It wasn't about proving anything or reclaiming power. It was about connection, and that realization scared me more than the act itself, because it meant this wasn't something I could easily dismiss as a mistake. Afterward, lying there in the quiet that follows when adrenaline fades and reality creeps back in, we didn't rush to justify ourselves or label what had happened. We just existed in it, aware that something irreversible had occurred without needing to dramatize it. I knew then that whatever came next would be complicated and probably painful, but I also knew I wasn't disappearing anymore, not from my own life, not from my desires, and not from the consequences of choosing to step across a line that had been waiting for both of us to stop pretending it wasn't there. She didn't find out the way I'd imagined she might, through some dramatic confrontation or an accidental confession, because life rarely follows the clean arcs we rehearse in our heads, and instead it came crashing in sideways, messy and unavoidable, carried by someone else's mouth and someone else's panic. I knew something was wrong before I knew what it was, because my phone lit up with her name after weeks of silence, and just seeing it there felt like a violation of a boundary she'd insisted on herself, a sudden demand for access after she'd made it very clear I was supposed to stay erased. I didn't answer at first, not out of strategy or restraint, but because my body reacted faster than my mind, my chest tightening with a familiar mix of anger and dread. And when the second call came through, followed by a string of messages that grew sharper with each one, I understood that whatever she'd learned, it had already detonated. When I finally picked up, her voice was already raised, already vibrating with outrage, and she didn't waste time easing into it, accusing me of betrayal, of manipulation, of crossing a line I'd apparently been expected to respect long after she'd pushed me out of her life. She talked over me when I tried to respond, her words tumbling out in a rush that felt rehearsed, as if she'd been waiting for an excuse to unleash everything she'd been holding back, and it struck me how quickly she'd reframed the situation, how effortlessly she'd cast herself as the injured party, ignoring the part where she'd told me to disappear, ignoring the part where she'd already been emotionally elsewhere while I was still trying to understand what I'd done wrong. The irony was almost impressive, the way she spoke about loyalty and trust with such conviction, as if those concepts hadn't been optional for her weeks ago. What surprised me most wasn't her anger, but the absence of sadness beneath it, because there was no grief in her voice, no sense of loss, just rage at the idea that something had happened outside her control, that a narrative she thought she owned had slipped out of her hands. She demanded explanations she'd never offered herself, demanded accountability from me while refusing to acknowledge her own role in how things had unfolded, and as she spoke I realized she wasn't talking to me at all. She was talking to the version of me she'd constructed, the one who existed solely to justify her choices. When she finally paused long enough for me to speak, I didn't raise my voice or defend myself the way she seemed to expect, because something in me had gone very still, very clear, and I told her calmly that she didn't get to tell me to disappear, and then be outraged when I stopped living my life according to her comfort. I told her that whatever loyalty she thought she was owed had ended the moment she decided I was disposable, and saying it out loud felt like setting something down I'd been carrying for far too long. That was when the conversation turned uglier, because calm has a way of infuriating people who want to fight, and she accused me of doing it out of spite, of trying to hurt her, of choosing the one person who would wound her most, and I almost laughed at that, because it revealed more than she probably intended. It wasn't about me or her best friend or even the relationship we'd lost. It was about control, about the assumption that even in absence, I was supposed to orbit her feelings, to remain static and available in whatever way suited her story. She threatened consequences then, vague and dramatic, talking about what people would think, about how this would look, about how I was going to regret it. And I realized she was trying to scare me back into invisibility, trying to make disappearing feel like the safer option again. Instead of responding, I let the silence stretch, not as punishment, but as refusal. And eventually she hung up, leaving behind a quiet that felt very different from the one she'd imposed on me weeks earlier. When I put the phone down, I didn't feel triumphant or shaken, just strangely grounded, because for the first time since all of this began, the roles had shifted without me having to force them. She knew now that I wasn't waiting in the wings, that I wasn't frozen in the moment she'd left me, and whatever anger she was feeling belonged to her, not to me. I understood then that this wasn't the climax she imagined it to be, but the beginning of something else entirely, because once someone sees you refuse to disappear a second time, they're forced to confront the fact that they never truly had the power they thought they did. After that call, something fundamental shifted inside me, not in a cinematic way, but in the slow, irrevocable manner of a door closing that you don't bother reopening because you finally understand what was on the other side. I didn't block her number or announce some dramatic boundary, because I wasn't interested in gestures anymore. I was interested in behavior, and the simplest, most honest behavior was refusing to engage on terms designed to shrink me. She tried again the next day, this time through messages that swung wildly between accusation and familiarity, as if invoking our shared past might reassert some claim over my present. And reading them, I felt a strange detachment, like I was watching someone argue with a version of me that no longer existed. What followed wasn't a clean break, but a clumsy attempt on her part to regain narrative control, because suddenly mutual friends started reaching out with carefully worded concern, asking how I was holding up, hinting that things had gotten complicated, and I recognized the pattern immediately. She wasn't telling the whole story, just enough to cast doubt, to position herself as hurt without explaining why. And for a brief moment the old instinct kicked in, the urge to correct the record, to defend myself preemptively before assumptions hardened into facts. That instinct passed, replaced by something steadier, because I realized I didn't need to convince anyone of anything if I simply stopped participating in a story that depended on my reaction to function. I didn't deny what had happened, but I didn't explain it either, answering questions plainly and without embellishment, refusing to add emotional color where none was required, and that neutrality unsettled people more than any dramatic confession would have. I could see it in the way conversations stalled, in the way they waited for outrage or justification that never came, because when you don't perform the role assigned to you, the script starts to fall apart on its own. I wasn't hiding anymore, but I wasn't volunteering myself for judgment either, and that balance felt like reclaiming a space I'd never known how to occupy before. With her best friend, things were quieter but heavier, marked by a mutual understanding that whatever this was, it couldn't exist in the shadows forever, not without cost. We talked openly about what we'd done, about the mess we were standing in the middle of, and about the fact that neither of us wanted to be anyone's secret or weapon. And there was something grounding in that honesty, something adult and unromantic that made me trust her more, not less. There was still attraction, still sex that carried a charge precisely because it wasn't rushed or reckless, but there was also a shared refusal to turn it into spectacle, and that restraint felt like its own quiet form of defiance. The most telling moment came when my ex tried one last time to pull me back into orbit, sending a message that pretended concern while dripping with implication, asking whether I was happy with the choices I'd made, as if my happiness was something she still had the right to audit. I read it twice, felt the familiar flicker of anger, and then let it go unanswered, not because I didn't have a response, but because I finally understood that responding was the response she wanted. Silence, when chosen instead of imposed, is a different thing entirely, and in choosing it this time, I wasn't disappearing. I was standing exactly where I was, visible and unmoved, letting her feel the absence she'd assumed she controlled. In the days that followed, the noise around the situation gradually faded, not because everything resolved neatly, but because there was nothing left for it to feed on, and I realized how much of what we call conflict is sustained by attention, by the endless exchange of explanations and defenses. I wasn't interested in proving I'd been wronged or vindicated. I was interested in living in a way that no longer required her permission or understanding, and that decision, more than anything else, felt like the moment I truly stopped disappearing, not just from her life, but from my own. I didn't plan for consequences, not in the calculated sense people imagine when they hear the word revenge, because I wasn't pulling strings or leaking screenshots or orchestrating confrontations. I was just living openly in a way that stopped cushioning the fallout for someone who'd never done the same for me. The ripple effects started small, almost imperceptible, with subtle shifts in tone when mutual friends spoke to her, longer pauses when she told stories that used to land cleanly, questions that followed her explanations instead of nods, and I watched from a distance as the version of events she'd been circulating began to strain under its own weight. It turns out stories require maintenance, and when the person you're casting as the villain refuses to behave like one, the narrative starts to fray because people notice inconsistencies even when they don't want to admit it. She'd say I was cold, and someone would mention how calm I'd been. She'd say I'd moved on too fast, and someone else would remember how long she'd checked out before the breakup. Nothing explosive happened, no public reckoning or dramatic apology, just a gradual erosion of certainty that left her explanations sounding rehearsed and incomplete, and that slow unraveling was far more satisfying than any confrontation could have been. I could feel her frustration through secondhand reports, through the way she tried to reinsert herself into conversations that no longer revolved around her, through the increasingly sharp edge to her attempts at humor when my name came up. And I understood then that consequences don't always arrive as punishment. Sometimes they arrive as loss of control. She could no longer dictate how the ending was understood, no longer rely on my silence to fill in the gaps she'd left, and the realization seemed to unsettle her more than anger ever had. With her best friend, the consequences were different, heavier and more personal, because loyalty isn't an abstract concept when it's been lived for years. And I watched her wrestle with that in real time, questioning memories, reassessing moments she'd once brushed off, coming to terms with the fact that loving someone doesn't obligate you to excuse everything they do. Our relationship didn't suddenly become easy or uncomplicated, but it became honest in a way that felt rare, because neither of us pretended the situation was clean or heroic, and that honesty extended to sex too, which carried a weight now that wasn't just desire, but decision, a mutual choosing that acknowledged the mess without trying to disguise it as something else. There were nights when the gravity of it all settled in, when we talked about what this meant long term, about the friendships that might not survive, about the possibility that things would get harder before they got easier. And those conversations were sobering without being bleak, because for the first time I wasn't navigating someone else's discomfort at the expense of my own. I didn't need to justify why this connection mattered, because it existed regardless of anyone's approval, and that sense of groundedness made me realize how much of my previous relationship had been spent managing perception rather than living truthfully. Eventually, the implosion she'd been trying to avoid arrived quietly, in the form of distance rather than drama, because people stopped asking questions she couldn't answer and started drawing their own conclusions instead. Friend groups shifted, invitations changed, and while no one staged an intervention or demanded accountability, the absence of automatic sympathy spoke volumes, and I could see how deeply that unsettled her. It wasn't that she'd been publicly exposed. It was that she could no longer rely on being automatically believed, and that loss, more than any argument, seemed to strip away the certainty she'd always carried. Watching all of this unfold, I felt no urge to gloat or intervene, just a calm recognition that consequences had a way of arriving on their own schedule when you stop shielding someone from them, and I understood then that the most effective revenge I'd enacted wasn't intentional at all. It was simply refusing to lie for someone who'd already rewritten me out of their story, and letting the truth exist without decoration or defense, trusting that it would do what it always does eventually, which is settle into the spaces where denial can no longer reach. If you'd asked me at the beginning how I wanted it to end, I probably would have described something loud and vindicating, a moment where she realized exactly what she'd lost and had to sit with it while I walked away untouched. But endings don't usually arrive dressed the way we imagine them, and this one came quietly, almost anticlimactically, slipping into place while I wasn't looking. The irony of it all didn't hit me at once. It revealed itself slowly, in the absence of tension, in the way my days stopped orbiting her reactions, in the realization that I hadn't checked her social media or asked about her in weeks, not because I was forcing myself not to, but because the impulse simply wasn't there anymore. Disappearing, the thing she'd demanded like it was a punishment, turned out to be the only gift she ever gave me, because it forced me out of a position where I was constantly explaining myself, negotiating my worth, shrinking my needs to fit someone else's comfort. I didn't win by humiliating her or taking something from her. I won by stepping out of a dynamic that required me to stay small in order to function. There was no moment where she apologized or admitted fault, no late-night message confessing regret, and that lack of closure would have destroyed me once. But now it felt irrelevant, like waiting for a receipt from a transaction I'd already walked away from. With her best friend, what remained wasn't some dramatic declaration or fairy tale promise, but something quieter and more durable, built on the fact that we'd seen each other clearly from the start, without illusions about who we were or what this had cost. We didn't pretend our beginning wasn't complicated or that it hadn't hurt people, but we also didn't apologize for choosing honesty over convenience, and there was something grounding in that, something that made the connection feel earned rather than stolen. Sex between us never lost its charge, but it gained a depth that came from trust, from knowing neither of us was using the other as a reaction or a weapon, and that difference mattered more than I'd expected. Occasionally, fragments of the old story would drift back to me, a comment someone made in passing, a look that lingered too long, reminders that not everyone approved or understood, and I let those moments pass without grabbing onto them, because I'd learned how much energy it takes to keep a narrative alive once you stop feeding it. She still existed in my world in the abstract sense, as someone I'd once loved and then outgrown in the most abrupt way possible. But she no longer had access to me, not emotionally, not narratively, not in the quiet spaces where self-doubt used to live. The strangest part was realizing that I didn't feel hardened or cynical at the end of it all, just clearer, like I'd finally learned the difference between disappearance and absence. Disappearing had been an act of compliance, of making myself smaller because someone else demanded it. But absence, chosen freely, was an act of self-respect, and understanding that difference changed how I moved through the world. I stopped chasing explanations from people who weren't willing to be honest, stopped mistaking intensity for intimacy, stopped believing that being chosen required enduring erasure first. There was no final confrontation, no scene where paths crossed and eyes locked across a room, just a gradual understanding that whatever power she thought she'd held over me had evaporated the moment I stopped needing her to see me. That was the real ending, not revenge in the cinematic sense, but something far more effective and far less fragile, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when she told me to disappear, she unknowingly pushed me toward a life where I no longer needed her permission to exist, and where being seen by the right person felt natural instead of negotiated.